Husband's darkest secret revealed after death. Margot Chambers loved and adored her husband. Bruce was everything she wanted in a man, with his barrel chest and strong jaw, running his construction company like a king. No one messed with Bruce Chambers. Even after nearly 20 years, Margot was still proud to bear his name. He was a wonderful father to their 2 children, tolerated her estranged son from her first marriage, and was a fantastic lover. Although the frequency of their sex life had declined somewhat over the years, the quality had not deteriorated. Bruce was as assertive, passionate, and fearless as he had been when they first met, and Margot loved being his wife. So when Margot answered the phone one afternoon and heard a woman sobbing in the receiver, her first reaction was disbelief. It couldn't have been Carol, the office manager at Bruce's company, as accomplished and reserved a woman as Margot had ever known, and what she was saying between sobs was impossible either. Bruce was a trim man of 55. He worked out at the gym in the basement and went out jogging almost every night. A man like that doesn't just fall down. Even if he did, he would have already been taken in an ambulance to the hospital where he would have fought for his life and won. This is Bruce Chambers we're talking about. He's never lost a fight in his life. But when the phone was handed over and Margot heard the somber, calm voice of Bruce's business partner, Ray, it all became real. Bruce had collapsed in his office and died before the ambulance arrived. Heart failure, they said. If Margot wanted to see her husband, she would have to go to the hospital morgue. Margot finished talking, dropped to her knees and howled in fear like a bear in a trap. Everyone had been so kind. Her family, her friends, everyone Bruce had worked with, they had all shown more love and support than Margot could have hoped for. Even her first husband, Jim, called her to offer his condolences. They had a pleasant half-hour conversation during which he promised to talk to Lucas. Their son was now 22 years old, and he hadn't spoken to Margot in 5 years. Perhaps this could be the first step toward reconciliation. Bruce's parents were still alive, and he had a sister. They were all grief-stricken, of course, but the funeral expenses were shared with Margot, and Sister Barbara took care of most of the arrangements. The service was held in a huge church, and a lot of people came to the service. Bruce was a pillar of the community and a popular guy. Sitting in the front row and watching 17-year-old Jerry and 14-year-old Tom deliver eulogies in honor of their father, Margot couldn't imagine how proud she could be of them. Both Jim and Lucas came in dark, neat clothes, not formal black suits and ties like most men. Father and son had intended to sit in the very last row of the church, but Margot's parents didn't want to hear about it. Margot felt a prick of jealousy as Lucas hugged his grandparents and shifted her gaze to the front of the church. Her gaze fell on her late husband's coffin, and she wished Bruce would hug her tightly. This whole mess with Lucas never seemed so bad when her big, strong man was cradling her against his strong chest. After the burial, people approached the next of kin to offer their condolences. Margot tried to focus on the people coming up to her, but her heart was racing. Jim and Lucas joined the line of well-wishers, and in less than a minute she would be able to look into the eyes of her oldest child. Margot had been 24 when she'd given birth to Lucas, only 2 years older than he was now. She'd heard his voice as he exchanged words with his half-brother and sister. And here he was, a young man in a neat dark shirt and jacket, looking at the 46-year-old woman he called Mom. She could still see the rage in his eyes, but he was clearly determined to respect the situation. Margot felt proud of him, but she had the good sense not to say it out loud. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It's so good to see you." She meant it. In fact, it was so obvious that she meant it that both of them were a little confused. Lucas swallowed and looked at the brooch holding up her neckerchief. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. He nodded stiffly and walked away. Margot turned away and watched him walk across the grass between the headstones. Jim walked over and stood beside her, following her gaze. Margot cleared her throat. "Maybe we can. Talk later?" she said. "Of course," Jim replied. But when everyone gathered, moved to Margot and Bruce's luxurious home for the wake, Jim and Lucas were nowhere to be seen. For the headstone, Margot had chosen a classic rectangle of polished granite, solid and unpretentious. It suited Bruce. Along with his name and dates, she'd carved the inscription, "A fearless husband and loving father." He would have loved it. Margot visited the grave almost every day. The feeling of emptiness almost never left her, so the still stone block was comforting. It reminded her to be fearless. She had 2 children approaching adulthood, and they needed her strength. Her friends told her she was still an attractive woman, but Margot couldn't even think of anyone else right now. Bruce had insured his life, typical of him to think of such things. And she had inherited his share of the construction company. Still, Margot wasn't ready to think about that, so she concentrated on being careful with the money she had. One late October afternoon, about 6 months later, Margot was walking through the churchyard on her daily visit when something made her stop on the path. There was a woman standing by Bruce's grave, leaning against the headstone the way someone bows to a baby. Margot could only see her from the back, but her long, black, slightly disheveled hair and stylish clothes immediately suggested feminine attractiveness. The woman was holding onto a granite stone with her hand, and Margot felt like yelling at her to stop touching it. The woman straightened up. She was short, but held herself high, her black-heeled boots visible beneath the hem of her long, honey-brown coat. She kissed her fingers and transferred the kiss to the top of the headstone. After standing for a moment, she turned to leave. Margot felt her throat constrict. She guessed that the woman would be attractive, but she still wasn't prepared for how beautiful the young woman's face would be. She had dark eyes and lashes, slightly harsh eyebrows, and there was a liveliness in her expression, as if she found the world beautiful and fascinating. The woman was walking down the main path, heading for the churchyard gate, which meant she had to pass Margot. They briefly glanced at each other, and the black-haired woman nodded politely to Margot, stepping around her. Margot grinned back. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman stopped in place. "I beg your pardon?" I said, "Who are you? It's none of your business who I am." "That's my husband's grave over there, that's what I think." The woman blinked. Then her face spread into a huge, surprised grin. "Oh, no," she said. "You're Margot." Margot stepped back as if the woman had hit her. The woman whined and shook her head. Then the smile returned, a little sheepishly, and she looked at Margot with a kind of warmth, as if they had been duped by the same con man. Margot did not smile back. "I asked you a question," she said. "Yes, I know," the woman replied. "And if you are Margot, I would be happy to answer it. But before I do, I have a question for you." The young woman straightened up and looked her interlocutor straight in the eye. "Do you really want to know who I am?" Margot felt a sudden uneasiness. The cold feeling that had just rumbled through her stomach suggested that she wasn't going to like what this woman had to say. Making matters worse was the fact that the woman didn't seem to have any self-serving intent, which meant that her warning was most likely genuine. Margot knew from experience how difficult it was to brush aside hurtful words if the person who said them had no malicious intent. But if this woman left without telling her anything, Margot would always wonder who she was. Or rather, who she was. To Bruce. Margot guessed that Bruce had probably slept with this woman. But what else? And how often? Perhaps it was better to know for sure than to let her imagination run wild. "Tell me," Margot said. "All right," said the woman. "You have been warned." The woman stood up. Margot tensed. "I'm a love industry worker," the woman said. "And Bruce was my client. My husband didn't use such services." "Actually, he didn't. But he came to me." "I don't believe you." "Okay, you're welcome." The woman turned to leave. Margot was out of breath. "Why would he go to you?" she shouted. "Look, Margot." "May I call you Margot?" "What should I call you?" "You can call me Faya. Is that your professional name?" It's the name your husband knew me by. Faya looked toward the tombstone, her expression wistful. He never learned my real name. Margot stared at the woman, trying to figure out what the illicit connection was. Despite what Fi had said, it was clearly more than money, unless women in this profession were in the habit of visiting their clients' graves. "How did you find him?" Margot asked. "I hadn't seen him for months," said Faya. "It was normal. Then one evening I got bored and started to Google him. That's when I came across the obituary. It's a shame. He was a very special person." "Why was he special to you?" "Oh, it's a long story." Faye seemed to be struck by an idea. She looked at Margot, sizing her up. "I charge $300 an hour," she said. "If you're interested in learning more." "I'm not paying you for a story. Don't you think I have a right to know?" "No, honestly, I don't." Faya gave her a charming smile. "I'm going to have lunch at that little cafe I saw on the road," she said. "And if I don't see you again, I wish you a pleasant life." Faya started down the path. She had a jaunty gait that annoyed Margot. Margot had always thought she and Bruce had an exceptionally good sex life, and the thought that he might not feel the same way was a terrible blow. But what could have been missing? Margot was ready for anything they could imagine. Bruce always said how lucky he was to be married to such a sexually adventurous woman. Sure, Faye was younger, but that wasn't the only thing, was it? Margot walked over to Bruce's headstone. The inscription flashed through her mind. "An infuriating asshole and liar." "Why, Bruce!" she shouted, looking at the granite rectangle. Faya was sitting at a small round table covered with a white lace tablecloth, looking out the window framed by flowery, frilly curtains. She had just finished a surprisingly tasty Caesar salad and was wiping her mouth with a napkin when a pudgy Margot entered the tiny establishment. The bell above the store door jingled like an alarm, but Faya smiled and invited the woman to approach. Margot walked past the other customers to a table by the window, her face dark with displeasure. "Please have a seat," Faya said, gesturing to a vacant chair on the opposite side of her table. Margot lowered herself into the chair, placing her bag on her lap. She looked furious. "I suppose you need cash?" she said grudgingly. "I'm afraid so," Faya replied. "My wallet is too small for a credit card machine." Margot extended her fist across the table, on which lay rolled up fresh bills from the ATM. Faya took the money and discreetly put it in her purse without checking it. The waitress, an older woman and owner of the cafe, came to clear the dishes. Faya gave her a dazzling smile and ordered tea for two. Watching her, Margot sensed that she was enjoying herself. "So," said Faya as the waitress left, "where would you like to start? How did you meet Bruce?" "I was working at this gentleman's club. There was a bar and a small dance floor and private rooms that could be rented by the hour. Myself and the other girls would socialize with the men, talk them into buying us drinks, and if they were in the mood, take them upstairs for special favors." Sounds charming. Not a word I would have used. But everything was smooth and glitzy and very expensive. I was making good money. A waitress came over with a tray with a full tea service on it. There was a small round teapot with matching cups and saucers, a milk jug and a sugar bowl. On a tiny mini saucer were 4 chocolates. Faya looked around at the entire ensemble and flashed one of her brilliant smiles. "Now that's what I call charm," she said. The waitress smiled as she carried the tea facilities to the table. "You have a lovely place," said Faya, "and the salad was excellent." "Thank you." The older woman blushed, almost curtsied, and left. Faya poured 2 cups of tea, and Margot watched her from under her thrusting eyelids. "Speaking of charm," she said, "you're pretty good at putting it on yourself." "Thank you, Margot. Was that part of the training at the club?" "In a way," Faya replied coldly. "Part of my job is to make men feel good about themselves. It's like the opposite of being a wife." Margot shuddered. "I was good with Bruce. And now?" What does that mean? Listen, Margot, Faya said. Whenever I asked your husband why he married you, he always talked about how beautiful you were and what great sex you had. That was very important to him. Great sex. And yet, he was paying for sex with you? Not really. Faye sighed and took a sip of her tea, raising her pinky finger. Technically, of course, yes, she said. He'd book me for 2 hours, we'd undress, and sex would happen. But it was mostly at my insistence. I don't like taking money from a man and then not keeping my end of the bargain. And of the 2 hours, maybe 10 or 15 minutes were spent having sex. Mostly we lay with each other and talked. About what? About you. About his business. About how hard it was for him to be a man. Never showing weakness, never showing fear, always giving the impression that he was on top of things. But he's always been on top of things, Margot objected. He was just such a man. Margot, do you really believe there is such a thing as such a man? Only a psychopath is never afraid. I know. Bruce didn't think so. He believed that if he ever told you the truth about his fears and insecurities, you would lose your sex drive and leave him for another man. Why did he think that? Because that's exactly what you did to your first husband. Margot turned pale. My God, how many secrets, personal things had Bruce shared with this woman? The cup of tea stood in front of her, untouched and cooling. Look, I'm not saying this to judge you, Faya said. It's just that Bruce saw how you treated your first husband and decided not to repeat his mistakes. He even said once, when Margot talks about her ex, it's like she's giving me a roadmap of what not to do. Not to talk about what's bothering you, not to share how you really feel about it, and certainly not to talk about dreams, which may include cutting back on money-making activities. Because that's what your first husband did. And Bruce told me that you never stopped saying how nice it is to be with a real man who stays away from that kind of nonsense. Faye smiled and filled her cup from the teapot, as if they were discussing the price of eggs. Margot's jaw clenched. She looked out the window and shook her head. That's not fair, she said. You can't compare the two men. Bruce was aerial man, and Jim is a good man, but he doesn't know how to be a man. He just wasn't fit to be a husband. Yes, Bruce knew that's how you saw it, Faye said, that you didn't want him. You needed a fearless husband. That's not true. I've told Bruce many, many times that I want him to be himself more than anything. Yeah, but that's what you told your first husband. And when he took you at your word and told you who he was, you said he wasn't man enough, and you left him. So when you said to Bruce, I want you to be yourself, he took it to mean, I want you to be the kind of husband I want you to be, and for you to say it was your idea so I don't owe you. That's a lie. He has fearless husband written on his gravestone. What more proof do you need? Margot jumped to her feet, pounding the table and nearly knocking over the teacups. She was pale, her nostrils flared, and she stared intently at the other woman. But even as her rage overwhelmed her, there was desperation in her voice. You didn't know Bruce. You didn't know Bruce. No, you didn't know Bruce, Faya said. And you didn't want to know him. You wanted the perfect marriage, and if Bruce didn't provide it for you, you would have left him for someone who would. What do you know about marriage? You're a cheater. Faya jumped to her feet. No, you're the cheater, she shouted. You're the one who cheated on your first husband and then made both men lie to your child about it. You're the one who took a 10-year-old child away from his father when Bruce moved out and then filed a false child abuse report to get away from your ex. Margot's eyes darted up in horror. Yes, he told me about it, Faya said furiously. It was the first time we met. Bruce showed up at the club drunk, broken, and set on self-destruction. He had just found out what you were up to and was about to have sex with a dozen cheating women and ruin his marriage. Ironically, I was the one who talked him out of it. Why should I believe that? I don't care if you believe it. But my parents are divorced, and when I heard that there are 3 children in that emotional pit you created, I thought I should at least give it a try. Faya grabbed her coat, slipped it over her shoulders, and grabbed her purse. The waitress came over and stood nervously by her side, clearly wanting to intervene in the argument, but not knowing how to do so. Faya threw her an apologetic look and placed $50 on the table, almost double what was owed. Then, frowning, she pulled out the remaining bills and tossed them over to Margot's side of the table. "Here," said Faya, "your proceeds." Faya turned and left. The bell on the door jingled as it was opened, and after it closed, there was an awkward silence. Margot hadn't visited Bruce's grave in over a week. When she finally forced herself to go there, she was surprised at how plain the headstone looked. Gray, nameless, nothing special. The phrase "fearless husband" now seemed like a bad joke, and there was a strip of white bird droppings running through his last name. Margot had a pack of baby wipes in her bag for just such an occasion, but this time she didn't bother. Let the rain wash it all away. She left the churchyard and walked through the town, trying to sort out her emotions. She was very, very angry, and as she walked through the market square, she realized that the reason she was angry was because she felt like a sucker. She'd married Jim, thinking he was a real man, and then discovered there was nothing outstanding about him. Then she met Bruce and did exactly the same thing. Margot remembered how a few years earlier Bruce's company had come under investigation by the fraud department. It turned out to be the result of malicious rumors started by a competitor, and Bruce had sued them for the collective difference. But while all of this was going on, it was a serious concern, as even the possibility of a scandal could ruin them. Ray, Bruce's partner, had lost a lot of weight and looked like a warmed-over death, rings under his eyes and prematurely graying hair. While Bruce, though troubled, maintained a confident demeanor, a positive attitude, and continued to pay a lot of attention to his wife. In a world full of scary men like Ray and Jim, Margot had considered herself lucky to be with a real man like Bruce. But now it turned out that Bruce was no different. He was just as afraid of financial ruin as Ray was, and just as afraid of losing his children as Jim was. The only difference was that Bruce managed to hide it. And now Margot remembered how many evening meetings Bruce had at that time, sometimes even on weekends. She felt cheated. Instead of dealing with his fears as befitted a man, he had run to this little traitor. Margot realized that it wasn't the image of Bruce having sex with Faye that bothered her so much. That would at least indicate masculinity. No, it was the image of Bruce curled up on the bed, resting his head on the girl's lap and sobbing in fear while she stroked his hair and said, "There you go. Everything's going to be all right." Margot returned home and immediately went up to the bedroom. She started taking Bruce's clothes out of the closet and throwing them on the bed. She hadn't decided yet whether to sell them or give them to a charity store. But for now, she gathered them into a pile and put them in the spare room. When the kids got home, they could go through them if they wanted to keep them as keepsakes. It took Margot less than an hour to get her late husband's belongings out of the living space and into the spare room. Then she made herself a cup of tea and turned on her computer. A friend had emailed links to several dating sites aimed at Margot's age group, and another where potential cougars and toy boys could find each other. Margot decided to start profiles on all three sites. She was still a good-looking woman in her 40s and figured she could generate a decent amount of interest. Besides, she had to give herself a chance to be with a real man. There had to be such a man, right? The end! Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.